welcome to today's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. Today's episode of Attendance Bias features Adam Jerugim of Northern California. Together, we are going to break down April 18th, 1992's Harry Hood. When Adam first messaged me, he originally wanted to discuss this whole week of shows on the West Coast from the spring of 1992. Considering that I try to get these episodes down to about a commute, I'd say 40 minutes to an hour each, it seemed a little excessive to try to stuff 4 or 5 shows into one episode of Attendance Bias. Working together, we whittled it down to this one track from the band's show at Stanford University that spring. When Adam messaged me, however, and he brought up the idea of spring of 1992, I knew that I was immediately intrigued. One of my first tapes ever was from July 15th, 1992, at Trax in Charlottesville, Virginia. Of course, that's a few months after today's track, but I knew that there's something about 1992 that's extremely special about Phish and their development as a band, especially as improvisers. So I was thrilled that as we continued to speak, Adam and I really got into the nitty-gritty of what makes Phish special from 1992. In this case, the spring, their first jaunt to the West Coast, or at least the first jaunt to Southern California, where they really started to build up a fan base, and you'll be able to hear why when we break down this Harry Hood. So enough from me, let's join Adam Jerugim to talk about Harry Hood from April 18th, 1992 at Wilbur Field at Stanford University. Adam, thank you for joining me today on Attendance Bias. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Sure. This is one of the earliest tracks that anyone so far has selected for Attendance Bias. But this early development of the band's period, early 1.0, is always captivating to me. So I'm really excited to talk to you about Harry Hood from April 18th, 1992 at Stanford University in Palo Alto. I also think you have the distinction of being the first person on a mini episode to pick Harry Hood. So congratulations.
Thank you. This has been my favorite since the day. This was my first version I ever saw. It's been my favorite ever since. So I'm glad to talk about it.
I can't wait to hear more about how you got into Phish. So let's start with the Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
Attendance Bias Lightning Round.
So Adam, how did you first discover Phish in a nutshell?
I had a very good friend in college who started getting tapes, and we started listening to them. And this was around fall of 1991. And I was actually ready to go and see the band for the first time at the Great American Music Hall in October of 1991, but missed my ride. Oh. So I had to wait till the next spring to see my first show.
And those shows, I think they're famously, Phish was the first band ever to sell out the Great American Music Hall being unsigned. They were the first unsigned band to sell out the Great American. I think they played 2 shows.
They did. They played 2 nights, and we were supposed to go the second night. My friends left without me.
Oh, lame.
Well, it's okay. I was running late. It wasn't like they just ditched me, but it was, one of those things where if I'd been there half an hour earlier, my first show would have been 6 months earlier.
And where were you in college?
At UCSC in Santa Cruz. So
what ended up being your first Phish show?
So my first Phish show was actually the first time that Phish played in Los Angeles on April 15th, 1992. It was actually a sold out show in LA, about 1,000 people in a theater. We actually got in trouble for both dancing and smoking in the venue. So it was really an interesting experience.
How do you get in trouble for dancing at a venue?
They wanted everyone seated. Yeah, the ushers wanted people seated. It was very, very bizarre. It took, that show wasn't very good. They must have had a curfew because it was only 2 hours long. The really good stuff started the next night. And that's the night I got it at the Anaconda in Santa Barbara.
Oh, that is a legendary show. We'll have to sneak in some conversation about that. That was the first show, not the first show I had on soundboard, but it was the first tape that I had where I realized how big a difference a soundboard made from early Phish. I remember Mike, especially during Possum. This is my favorite Possum ever from that Anaconda show. That is just right in my ears. So I can't wait to dig into that one. What was the most recent Phish show that you've seen?
The last one I saw was the Rescue Squad show, the New Year's show at MSG, where we're standing right under him when his platform broke. We're actually frightened for Trey because we could see he was completely scared. But yeah, that was my last show. So, and actually the very interesting thing is that was my 151st Phish show. And since Jerry died, I've also been at 151 Grateful Dead shows. So for the last 2 years, I've been stuck, and not by design, at 151 shows each. So my next show, which is supposed to be the first night of Dick's, I'll finally, after 25 years, see more Phish shows than Grateful Dead shows.
They will take the lead.
Yeah.
Until fall tour. This episode, I'm guessing, will air around the beginning of the fall, maybe late summer in September. Do you have any plans to see them at the Chase Center?
So under normal circumstances, I would go to most of the West Coast shows. I'm actually going to be, assuming I can get there, I'm going to be traveling and out of the country and returning, flying into San Francisco during the show the second night. I can't see it. There's no way that I'm coming in from out of the country after 25 hours on a plane and going to the show. Yeah.
If you could time travel back to any Phish show that you've attended already, aside from the one we're talking about, this one doesn't count, which one would it be and why?
So for me, it was the next night in Santa Cruz. So it's the Catalyst show in Santa Cruz on April 19th, 1992. Of the 5 shows that I saw, of the 4 of the legendary shows that I saw, it was probably the least greatest one. But for me, it was one of the 2 times I was able to walk from my house to the venue, where the venue was less than a mile from my house. They were playing Miles Davis beforehand. We got a spot on the front of the balcony, it's basically a walkway overlooking the stage, and the backstage at the time was in the back of the venue. So the band had to walk by us each time going on and off the stage. It was such a small venue, and it was completely sold out, but there was probably only 800 people there. To this day, it was one of the most incredible live music experiences I've ever had.
It sounds very personal.
Yeah.
If you had to select 1 or 2 tracks or highlights from that night for people at home to listen to, if they haven't heard the show yet, which ones do you remember best that you would suggest?
So it's interesting. It's kind of a tale of 2 bands. The thing that really makes that period interesting is you can tell they play all the time and they rehearsed all the time, and everything is perfect. You can hear on the soundboards the vocal cues of them like talking to each other while they're playing, saying, okay, I'm counting this off. We're about to do this crazy transition. The Stash, the Reba, the Maze. The Maze, to this day, because of that version, Maze is my favorite song. Well, that and Sleeping Monkey, but they're 2 different songs.
Both you and Paige.
Yeah, it's Sleeping Monkey for me. And that show, that Santa Cruz show, has the Sleeping Monkey stamp of approval. For me, only the special nights get Sleeping Monkey. Yeah.
And what is the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a Phish show?
Wow. I've seen a lot of really weird stuff.
This is my favorite question of the lightning round, because you always get the best answers.
Well, so my wife got pulled onto the stage during Meat Stick at Blossom in 2012, and that was kind of crazy. So she was on stage with a bunch of other people dancing Meat Stick. I flew home and she went to Alpine, and she got pulled onto stage again at Alpine for Meat Stick.
Was she the front row? I've never seen anyone get pulled on stage.
They were in the pit. Yeah.
Yeah, because the only time I remember, I saw Phish in 1999 at the Nassau Coliseum, and that was when the Meat Stick was kind of new. They played it on the summer tour. This was in the fall, and Sophie Dilloff, who was Paige's wife at the time, came on to teach the Meat Stick dance to everyone, but I've never seen a fan get pulled on. Was that a normal thing?
No, not at all. It was totally... it was so bizarre. Again, it wouldn't happen all the time, and it was funny because I was torn between that story and the fact that they had a bathtub on stage in San Francisco and everyone in the crew got in and out of the bathtub for Brother.
When was that?
That's the night before the Stanford show that we're going to talk about. This week has all sorts of antics. They had a kid with the ukulele at the shows. I mean, squirt gun breaks all the way through the Stanford show where they actually had a squirt gun and they were squirting the crowd. I mean, it was, different times for sure.
Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about the context in which this show was played.
When was this show played?
So today's show was played in the spring of 1992, and they toured from March 6th to May 18th, consisting of 54 shows. And that's just the spring tour. That's more shows than they allow themselves to play in a calendar year these days. The tour took them literally all over the country. They started in New Hampshire and New England in general. They went to the Mid-Atlantic, then to the Midwest, the Southwest, up the coast to Oregon and Eureka, California. Not quite your area, but close enough, I guess, when it comes to Phish. They went back across the Midwest and finished up in Western New York and Burlington. So when I looked at this, it struck me that this is one of those tours where Phish was proving that they were in the game. Like they were here to make a name for themselves and to prove that they were willing to put in the work rather than try and get a hit single or get something on the radio and have everything come to them. They were in the trenches during this. So where were you in the spring of 1992 that you crossed paths with Phish?
It's interesting. So I was already in Southern California for all things Passover.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually bailed on Passover to go to Phish, which didn't go over too well with my
I'm
family,
sure it
but
didn't.
that's
I've
something
been
else.
there.
Yeah. But so I was down there. They started their tour in LA, and we figured that we would just follow it up. So we saw the show in LA. The next afternoon, we were in Santa Barbara for the Anaconda show, and I actually spent an hour that afternoon with Trey and Dave Schools and Marley just hanging out outside the venue. So you have to understand, at this time, Phish wasn't big on the West Coast at all. Only a couple hundred people went to this Anaconda show. The band was just hanging out. They were really, what you were just saying, they were out to sell themselves, to prove themselves, right? They were still trying to get fans, trying to get people on the bus. Something I don't think that they need to do right now. Obviously, their fan base is so large, but at the time, and the fan base was a lot bigger back east. But it's interesting because these shows are so small. These crowds were 1,000 or less every venue. So again, if you're listening to the soundboards, you can hear them talking on stage. You can hear the vocal cues. You listen to that Binghamton show, which is a month before, and you can hear the crowd roaring for Wilson. And I was like, oh my God, this is where Phish is going, right? But they hadn't gotten there yet on the West Coast. They were still trying to prove themselves.
It's funny to talk about this and to hear about this. I was just speaking with a guest the other day about a show that she picked from 1990. And she picked a show from a New York City venue that's no longer there called The Marquee. And that was about 1,000-person capacity. And in 1990, they had outgrown the Wetlands, which was a 500-person capacity. And so this was her show that she picked was a full 2 years earlier than this one, that they're kind of starting over in a sense in the West Coast compared to building already what they had established back east.
Yeah, I mean, the Warfield holds 2,000 people and it was half full for their show.
Right. I don't think they played, you'll be the one to correct me probably. I don't know if they played the Warfield before 1994.
No, they played the first time in 1992 and then again in 1993. Oh, no, not in 1993, but I think definitely in 1994. I saw the Macaroni. So that's the other thing. One other weird thing is having that opera singer come out in the middle of the show, of the mac and cheese show at the Warfield. That was and having them hand out mac and cheese to everybody to shake along with the show. That was a pretty special night too.
And setlist wise, A Picture of Nectar was released right before the band started this spring 92 tour. And the tour would feature most of the songs that would eventually appear in Rift eventually within a year or so, 1993. So you originally wanted it, when your first email, you wanted to talk about this whole slew of shows. And I do my best to keep these episodes to about an hour. So I thought this would require an entire series. What is it about this week in California that grabbed you so intensely that you felt you could talk about it forever?
Well, it's that first show, the 15th, isn't really anything to write home about. The first show that they ever played in Los Angeles. It starts at the Anaconda show, which for a lot of people was their first tape they ever heard. And to be honest, if you listen to it, it's Trey explaining everything to everybody, right? It's Trey saying, this is what we do. This is Gamehenge.
Time in Southern California. So thank you. Very exciting. But right now what we want to do is, if we can bring it way down, we're going to take you on a little journey back to where we come from, which is a long way away from here. And we're happy to be here, and we're happy to be out here by the beautiful ocean and everything, but where we come from is far away from the ocean. So if you watch it right now, come with me while we just kind of open the roof up on top of this building and let some of the air flow in here. And just imagine we're lifting up off the ground and up into the sky. And as you go up in the air, you can look down, and you can see the lining of the shore go away and the little oil pumps out there in the middle of the and all that, and it's kind of lifting up, and you can get up and now up there in the clouds a little bit, and we're going to take you with us now back to where we come from, because we're troubadours from a different place than around here. So we're coming with us now, and the clouds are lifting apart, and as we go off, you can start to see sort of the continental divide over there and the whole Colorado and everything. best Canada.
This is, and I didn't know what it was, right? I was a brand new fan. Like, that was the night that it clicked for me. And I'd hung out with Trey. The next day we get to San Francisco and Mike is hanging out in front of the venue. And I was like, Mike, what do you think of the show last night? He said it was the best show we've played so far.
He probably says that all the time.
Yeah, but I mean, there was a feeling like something really special was going on. And it really starts at that Santa Barbara show and ends at that Eureka show, which unfortunately I wasn't at. But luckily I got to see 4 out of 5. But these are like some of the most important formative shows for them in their journey from a band that's playing songs to a band that is able to take their songs and do things with them. Because at this point, it's all rehearsed. They're playing a lot. You can hear they're playing a lot. You can hear they're rehearsing a lot. It is all precision. There's a few parts where they stretch things out, but everything is pretty predictable, but also no flubs. It's all perfect. The tones are perfect. Paige sounds perfect. Trey sounds perfect. It's really something special. And if you don't mind Mike playing slap bass, it's all over it.
Well, I think, speaking of Mike, I remember him, I think it was in the Fish book, which was compiled by Richard Gere. Mike, I think there's a quote from him that said, we played 2 types of gigs back in like the late 80s and early 90s. Either there were sloppy gigs with incredible jams, or there were tight gigs with no jams at all. And that kind of describes what you were just saying. Today's Harry Hood is, I think, 13 minutes long. It might be the longest track of the set, maybe of the show. It was played toward the end of set 2, which contained 19 songs. You look in this tour that just started, summer 2021, most of the second sets are about 6 songs apiece.
Yeah. It's totally different way of playing for them.
According to Fish.com, it says that this was an all-ages free daytime show. I don't know what this means. Maybe you could shed some light. On Fish.com, it calls it, and forgive my pronunciation, a Rinkendelt party, that there were no tickets, no fences, or any notable security.
Exactly. That was exactly what it was. It was the band set up on a soccer field, and anyone who wanted to come could just come and be there. And there were a couple hundred people.
Was it sponsored by
It was sponsored by one of the on-campus groups. Right. And I think originally, like maybe a frat or something. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, all we knew was that there was a free show. I saw 1 free Fish show and 1 free Grateful Dead show out of those 151 shows.
But that's more than I've seen.
Yeah.
I've never seen a free Fish show, knock on wood.
It's funny that you mentioned Nectar, because we'd really been listening to that a lot before these shows. So any song that they played off the Nectar was like, at that time, it was like, oh my God, this is fantastic. To open a second set with Glide, I mean, come on.
It's my favorite song.
I know. I mean, it's like, is there a more perfect way to open second set?
And if it was a daytime show, do you remember roughly, I know it was many years ago, but do you remember roughly when this was played? Because we're so used to shows starting Eastern time, at least at 8:15.
Yeah, this was, early afternoon. It was over while the sun was still out.
That's so fun. It's like being on the West Coast for the Super Bowl.
Yeah, it was, and there was one other thing. So Widespread Panic was opening for Fish the first 3 shows. So I saw them play 1 set in LA and then Fish 2 sets, 1 set in Santa Barbara and Fish 2 sets, 1 set in San Francisco and Fish 2 sets. That night, Widespread Panic was headlining their own show at the Catalyst.
Oh, wow. Well, they used to do that a lot, right? They used to trade off slots, and in the South, mostly Fish would open for Widespread and vice versa. Widespread would open for Fish north of the Mason-Dixon.
Yeah. So that night, I think that part of the rationale for having that daytime show was to let people go to the Widespread show at night, which I didn't go to. We were resting up for the Santa Cruz show the next night. I mean,
of course,
5 shows, 5 nights in a row. Yeah.
So the last question I have from this segment is, we're going to talk about Harry Hood from this show. What about Harry Hood stood out to you?
There are a couple things about this Hood in particular. One is the Peanuts theme, which everyone loves, right?
Yeah, I love it.
And I mean, you got to love it. You can't not love it. And it's funny how kind of Trey falls into it. And then there's, an 80-second bliss peak at the end, which is just like, how else do you want a show to end after whatever, 19 songs, I mean, that's a really great way to send everybody home, though they did play, Big Black Furry Creatures from Mars and Contact as an encore. So they were still in goofy mode, but this was the end of this is like the finale fireworks for the show, right?
Yeah. So for the first minute or so, Hood is instantly recognizable. You know, if you took a fan who got into Fish yesterday, knows a bunch of songs, spun them in a circle, and played this for them, it's still Harry Hood. We still know it. Like the reggae feel is there. It's very crisp. Mike kind of leads the way a little more than Trey would in future years. And they have what I thought was a pretty mature sound for 1992. Because when I listened to early shows in the early 90s, at least, the thing that stands out to me most is Page's keyboards, because he didn't have the piano yet. And it's very obvious compared to what our ears are now used to. But it's still there. It's still Harry Hood. And it's kind of like Fisher-Price Harry Hood.
In a way. I mean, I really like his Hammond work. It's not instant. I think he gets to it 2 minutes in, maybe 3 minutes in, but it's really, really good and really tasteful. And it's funny how they kind of like, it takes them a few minutes, and we're going to get there in a minute, but it's interesting how they kind of, it spaces out a little bit a few minutes into it. Where they're kind of thinking like, maybe we could take this somewhere, but they didn't at that time take anything anywhere. So it's like, you could tell that there was a little seed planted there.
Right. There are hints. You're right that they don't quite push it out there. For most of, you could cut out maybe 2 minutes of this and it would just be Harry Hood, like a studio track. Right? There wasn't much, but there are, like you said, seeds. There are sprinkles on top of improvisation. You mentioned somewhere around 2 to 3 minutes in. I wrote notes down on that too, that you could already hear some experimentation where Page is, you mentioned his Hammond, that stood out to me also, while also twinkling the piano. I'm such a huge fan of that. And then my favorite part of this whole thing before the peak, well, I say my favorite, there's also the peanuts part. So everything is my favorite part. But my first favorite part is when Trey extends his feedback for a really long time.
It's where they start to kind of, that's one of those seeds where it seems like they're about to just drop out of the traditional structure of the song, but then they bring it back together. You know,
but it's there.
It's there. It was really, it's really, you can tell that he's kind of one with his tone at that point, where it's not as complicated as it is today. He knows exactly the sounds that he's going to get out of it, and he's going for it.
Yeah, on a recent
very rehearsed.
Yes, it is very rehearsed. This Hood, I agree with you that it is very well rehearsed, obviously, but they are willing to play a little bit. I think you used the word playful earlier.
Yeah, they open it up a little bit. You can tell that, in a few years later, by 1994, 1995, they would take it, 20 minutes. There's a few spaces, there are a few doors where now they would just walk right through them. And there they opened them up, but they didn't actually walk through.
Also noticeable is Fishman's snare drum. Did that, when you listened to it recently, I see you shaking your head. What are you thinking before I say anything?
It's so funny because back then he was such an incredible jazz influenced drummer in my mind, and so technical, so incredible. And I felt that he kind of lost some of that over the years. And mainly that's due to age and slowing down, right? But he's still an incredible drummer. He just can't, it's like listening to that llama. They can't do that anymore.
It's also the venues that they're playing. Yes. You're playing venues that are somewhere between 700 and maybe 1,200. A jazz influence is probably more appropriate than when you're playing Madison Square Garden.
Absolutely, right? And there are subtleties to his playing during this period. You can also hear it in early 1993 that are just amazing. It's worth listening to just Fishman and listening to what he does and the care that he puts into it and the flourishes that he does. He's not a straight ahead drummer. It's really something.
And he never has been. Even if you go back to their recordings from 1984, their first known recordings, it's like this guy, there's something different about that drummer. He's very noticeable. And Trey obviously noticed it right away before anyone else. About 7 minutes is where the jam begins, the traditional hood jam. And this is where they begin playing fairly sparse, where their compartmentalization of Harry Hood as we know it starts to form, where they all kind of drop out and Mike keeps the 3-chord progression going, but it's up to the rest of the band to do something with it. I told you earlier, when I listened to this Harry Hood, like all day, we're recording right now in my time zone. It's about 2:30 p.m. I was up at 9 a.m. and I've been listening to it basically on a track. So maybe this is where I was like, you could sense the build already, if not a peak itself. Like you start sensing the build. And I thought that 1992, that they were expanding their repertoire to a huge degree between A Picture of Nectar and Rift. Like those are any Fish fan's favorite songs that, off the top of their heads. They were not only expanding themselves, not in terms of songwriting, but also communicating as an improvisation group.
Yeah. And that's, where they're actually, you can hear them communicating with each other and actually building something new out of it.
That's something new at about 9.5 minutes is when we hear the beginnings of the famous Linus and Lucy jam, the theme from Peanuts. And my first thought, I used your word a lot without knowing that you were going to say it today. I wrote that Fish was very playful at this time. Like now we take it for granted. Why do you go to so many shows? Well, anything could happen on any night. But back then, I don't know what this means, but I thought it was really true back then. I think some conventions have developed, between then and now. But back then, it was really anything was up for grabs.
At any time, they could do anything, anytime, and they still, in theory, can. But things have formalized more than they were then. I mean, then anything could happen. It was really a loose scene, right? I mean, with only a couple hundred people at every show, up to 1,000. To be honest, it was actually shocking when they first played the Greek the next summer, where I was like, okay, great. Now they're a 7,000 person band on the West Coast.
And then again in 2010.
Yeah. Were you at those shows?
Yeah, I was.
Okay. So was I. All I'll say is that it was scary how crowded it was.
What do you mean? Because to me, it seemed very sedate. I mean, I'm used to East Coast shows also.
Sure. The shows were good. They weren't bad shows. The problem was it was overcrowded and kind of dangerous.
Dangerous, really?
Yeah, you couldn't. If there was a problem, nobody would have been able to get out of there.
My memories of it is you had to line up super early, of course, because it's all GA at the Greek. And if you didn't line up early enough, you couldn't find a seat or a space on the floor once you got in. So I hear what now that I'm talking through it. I thought it was pretty laid back. I really enjoyed it because I'm comparing it to my experience at like the Man in Philadelphia.
Totally different, right? And
Yeah.
East Coast, it's always been different energy between the two. West Coast is always more laid back. Well, I say that, but occasionally you get a crazy show.
Right. And to wrap up this part of the Linus and Lucy jam, they didn't have the patience that they have now back in 1992, but they had the dexterity and they had the sharpness that anything, like we talked about, anything could happen anytime. And this Linus and Lucy jam, I mean, I can't imagine anyone not liking it.
Unless you hate peanuts, but yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it brought smiles on everybody's faces. Imagine just dancing on a lawn barefoot, in the sun to this. It was hot. It was good.
Yeah, and it's so charming. And then around 12 minutes to wrap it all up, this is when they turn the corner and take it home. This is the Harry Hood that we all know and hope for, cross our fingers for when we see them tomorrow or last night.
Yeah, absolutely. It's basically 80 seconds of bliss, explosion, peak, put a smile on your face, and then the lyrics come back in. It's just amazing. And it's, it does that to me every time. And I've been listening to it for almost 30 years.
So what do you remember after the show was over, after the encore? Since it was in a big open soccer field, did everyone just disperse?
People hung out for a while. I mean, this is Trey's dog was running through the crowd the entire show.
Marley.
Yeah. So, I mean, Trey's dog was out there. People's kids were there. People went home because, as I said, widespread panic was happening the next night. I think the band wanted a little break too, in a way, because they were playing night after night after night after night. I mean, we hung out a little bit and then we all dispersed and we got ready for the next show. I mean, for us, it was important because the next show was in our hometown.
Adam, before we wrap it all up, any last thoughts, anything we didn't get to, whether it's about Harry Hood or this whole stretch in general, or just this show from April 18th, 92?
It's really interesting to listen to this carefully, the show, and hear, because it's such a small show in such a venue with such good acoustics, to actually hear them talking to each other on stage in a way that it's just impossible now in a venue like MSG. You're not going to hear them. You can hear them count stuff off, but I'm talking about mid-song having vocal cues to get the other guys back in at the precise time. You can always call Trey general consensus, but you can tell, and I know I've said this many, many times, that they were playing a lot and practicing a lot because everything is on. And they were out to sell themselves. They wanted to win over the West Coast.
And for anyone at home listening, this show is on fish.in, fishing as a soundboard. So if you want to hear them talking what Adam was talking about, it's very easily accessible and it's crisp and clear. It's a great recording.
Yeah, there's soundboards of all these shows except for the Catalyst show. So Kevin, if you're listening, you owe me a soundboard of the Catalyst show from Santa Cruz. Let's put that out as an official release.
I will DM this directly to him, to Kevin Shapiro.
I've sent him he has all my pictures from that Anaconda show. So if you want to see a picture of Anaconda, if you have the latest Fish Companion, if you open it up, the very first picture when you open it up is my picture from the Anaconda of Trey and the rest of the band on stage.
We're in the presence of a celebrity photographer.
I guess I was just taking photography at the time.
So Adam Jerugim, Harry Hood from April 18th, 1992 at Stanford. Thank you so much for coming on Attendance Bias, for bringing everyone's attention to this Harry Hood. It added a new favorite to my playlist. And just this whole era of Fish, spring 1992, is kind of underrepresented or underrated maybe as a whole. So anyone at home who's listening, highly recommend diving into that. And thank you so much for sharing not just the breakdown and your musical expertise of this Harry Hood, but also just your memories of what it was like to be in a certain time and place that has gone by.
Yeah, maybe next time we'll talk about the Crest show in Sacramento.
Oh, the Gay Mensch.
Yeah.
Fun. All right. Well, Adam, thanks again so much.
All right. Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And that's it for my interview with Adam Jerugim of Northern California about Harry Hood from April 18th, 1992 at Stanford University. I'd like to give Adam a big thanks for not only reaching out to appear on Attendance Bias, but also for working with me with such patience and understanding to whittle our conversation down to this single track out of a whole week of big highlights and interesting stories. I'd also like to thank Fish.in, Fishin', for providing the amazing soundboard track that we used in today's episode. I'd like to thank Fish.net and Fish.com for some background information about today's show. And of course, I have to thank you, the listener, for joining me each week on Attendance Bias. And if you enjoy Attendance Bias, please subscribe to the show on whichever podcast app you enjoy, and please leave a rating and a review as well. You can also look out for Attendance Bias on social media, specifically on Twitter and Instagram. Reach out and say hello, and I will send you a free sticker. Thanks again for listening to Attendance Bias, and I'll see you next week.